Idle. I'm here to give the weekly update about HPAI. I'm specifically in livestock, but I'm also going to give you a high-level overview of what's happening out there with poultry. So I'm going to go ahead and start my presentation this morning, and we're going to continue to do these updates as we get new information coming up from the USDA. At this point, just to start, just remember, so far so good. We have not had any cases of HPAI detected in dairy cattle in Washington state, but I am going to kind of give national trends and talk about the things that we're doing here at WSDA so that, we're prepared and we're at the ready in case we do get a detection here. All right, so first of all, we all know that from the beginning of this response for HPAI has very much been a One Health approach in our response. And even for the last 2 years, as we've been responding to this outbreak of HPAI in poultry and domestic birds, it's very much been a collaborative effort here in Washington state, and then the way we have moved forward with our response. And we've had a coordinated response all along. And we're planning to continue that response. And we have just awesome partners at DOH and Fish and Wildlife that we work with. And now that we've had the spillover event into dairy cattle, we are seeing more of a federal One Health approach as well, which is great. This is really where we need to be right now, because we all agree that the real big concern here is the way that avian influenza viruses are able to evolve, and we're seeing those spillover events occur into other species. So even though at this time, this is very much an animal health event, we certainly don't want to be complacent, and we want to make sure that we're paying attention to the concerns that we have for our human health throughout this response. So I really appreciate the coordinated One Health approach that we've all been taking to make sure that we're addressing those concerns and we're out ahead of this. Certainly, we are working with Department of Health, specifically Hannah Olteen and Beth Lipton, on weekly meetings where we really get together and we talk about, hey, what's the best way to distribute PPE? How do we make sure that it's available to folks? So we know we saw another case here. We saw 2 additional cases in Michigan in the last few weeks. I talked to the Michigan State veterinarian actually just on Friday, and she said, yeah, it's really looking like the person who most recently got infected had milk in their eye, and they were able to isolate that virus. I haven't seen any of the whole genomic sequences come out of that yet, but I would assume that one would probably be related. It looked like the one in Texas, though, was on a little bit separate branch. So they're not exactly sure how that was introduced, but very well could have been related to the dairy. So I think the most important thing we want to do right now is make sure that, especially once a farm is diagnosed with this disease in dairy cattle, we want to make sure those farm workers have PPE. We've been working with our Bovine Issues Working Group on this, and they are distributing the information that's been provided by CDC. We also have the handout here and guidance for farm workers about what PPE they should be wearing. But we all know there's a lot of zoonotic diseases on farms that are really concerning, and this isn't new for farm workers or farm owners. They know about PPE, they know about the risks of interacting with animals. And I would say that, a lot of farms already make PPE available, but we certainly are working with them to make sure they understand what additional PPE may be required, particularly around eye protection and goggles. And that's not something maybe that's typically worn on farms. So we are continuing to work on that front. So just real high level overview of what we're seeing right now in the United States with regards to HPAI and poultry. So this map is reflective of poultry. And this came out on Friday in the National SITREP. So again, 48 states total since the beginning of the outbreak 2 years ago, over 1,100 confirmed premises. And we're seeing our most recent detections in these states. So in Minnesota and Iowa, most recently in commercial flocks, Idaho, California and Michigan, I believe those were all backyard flocks. So you'll see in the last 30 days, we've had 9 commercial flocks, 6 backyard flocks, and 5.9 million total birds in the last 30 days that have been depopulated or have been euthanized due to this disease. So I think it's important to bring up what's going on in poultry so we don't forget about that. I mean, that's really been going on for the last 2 years. So when we think about PPE and we think about risk, we really do want to remember that, we have this virus. It's ubiquitous out there in the environment and wild birds, and our environment is heavily contaminated. And, we're pretty much seeing that risk is out there for everyone. But I would say, especially for those backyard flocks, that may be infected and have heavy contamination in the environment. So we don't want to forget about them as we think about dairy cattle and think about PPE for those workers. We also want to be thinking about backyard poultry and commercial poultry. So you'll see here, these are the last 2 states that had commercial poultry detections in Iowa and Minnesota. And there's certainly concerns with these because we haven't seen the sequences come through yet, but we are seeing this HPAI and dairy cattle moving out to poultry farms. And so that's a real concern, and then poultry back to dairy. And we know that that's a real big concern, especially in these states that have big industries for poultry and dairy that are right next to each other. So something that we're keeping a close eye on. In Washington state, we haven't had a detection of HPAI in backyard or commercial poultry since December. And we've had 45 affected backyard flocks and just 1 commercial flock in 17 counties. But it's been a while since we've seen a detection, knock on wood. But we are at the ready. We are very good at responding to these. We've been doing it for 2 years, like I said. And it hasn't been easy. It's been a long 2 years, but we've learned a lot. And I just want to make sure everyone knows that we have worked, like I said, in this kind of One Health response mechanism for a long time and in unified command with USDA. And so we're ready for this. We know how to respond to HPAI, whether it's in poultry or it's in dairy cattle or any other species. So just real quick, I wanted to make sure everybody remembered about what our poultry industry looks like here in Washington state. We do have 9 commercial poultry operations, and they're fairly large. So we have 7 table egg layers with about 9 million birds and 2 broiler operations with about 29 million birds. And we also have 2 hatcheries at about 64 sites. So, you know, these 2 broilers and these 7 table egg layers aren't just located in 2 locations. They're spread out among about, 500 different locations. And we have over 800 organic backyard flocks that we know about. And then there's everybody else who has a few in their backyard. So we don't want to forget about the poultry industry as we kind of move over, and everyone's sort of really been focused on this spillover event into domestic livestock. So I don't think this map is 100% up to date. I believe there may be another detection that will be announced in Wyoming, but I'm not sure. I haven't seen that officially. But right now, as of Friday, there were 69 premises in 9 states. And just keeping in mind that denominator of 32,000 dairies in the United States. So again, as we look at this, we just want to make sure that we're keeping tabs. This is on the HPAI and domestic livestock landing page. So that map is there and you can go and look at it anytime. But I know there were some concerns, and I've heard this feedback in the last few weeks about, hey, we feel like we're out of the loop. Like, how many tests are really being run? Are you even running any tests? So USDA did provide this data, and I thought it would be important to share. And that is that we've had the total number of PCR tests run by Nolan Labs and NVSL since April of 2022. So, I mean, this is a lot of tests in just a few months. We've had over 9,500 tests done. And those pre-movement tests as a result of the federal order, about 3,400. And then the genetic sequences are all being shared as well. And I wanted to mention real quick that this snippet is coming out of a monthly report that Erin Coyle is putting together. She's our emergency management program manager, and she does an awesome job. And you can find this on our website, and I'll show you later on where you can find it. But I wanted to give her credit because she just does an awesome job of summing up this information into a nice tight package that's really easy to review and understand. So we all know about the federal order. That's been in place now since the end of April. So what are we at here? About a month and a half. So, I mean, a lot of tests have been done in just a month and a half. If you think about it, a lot of work has been done. A lot of research has been done. But I know sometimes everybody still feels like they're in a vacuum. But I really have to give USDA a lot of credit here. Like, we've really come a long way in a short amount of time. And they're really been very good about listening and trying to move forward with what are next steps and what should we do and how do we respond, and really try to make this work. But again, the goal of USDA is to eradicate HPAI from the dairy herd. And I think we can still do it. There's still a chance, but we do see that it moves very rapidly once it gets introduced into a herd or into a state. So our goal in Washington here is to keep it out. That's really what we want to do. We've already reviewed this before, that USDA is able to financially support infected herds and incentivize those herds, especially with regards to biosecurity, but there's other areas that they can support those herds. And we are not one of those states yet, but if we are, we will certainly lean in and be prepared for that. One of the other things to mention is they are working with ELAP as well, so that those herds that have been affected and have had that drop in milk production of up to 10 to 20% drop in milk production, they're hoping to be able to recoup some of the costs or some of the losses of that milk. So that's really good news for dairy producers, and hopefully that will encourage them to participate in the upcoming voluntary program that USDA just sort of rolled out at the end of last week. So right now there's a lot of field activities being done. This slide was shared from USDA just a few weeks ago. They're continuing to work on the questionnaire and trying to get the epidemiological questionnaires completed so that we can better understand how this thing is moving around. They're also doing the on-farm sampling, so that's being done through a voluntary program, and they're going to roll that out into multiple states. Hopefully we'll be one of those shortly. And then they're also doing a lot of testing of wildlife and paradomestic species to try to figure out what is the role of that wildlife when we get an infected herd, or is there a role of the wildlife spreading this around? And then also putting together some strike teams because they're trying to put this data together. I was just at the Western States Livestock Health Association meeting last week. That's all the Western state animal health officials, so people like me that are in our states, to get together to talk about this. And I did learn there that SIA is putting together some research on this. And so they're starting to do more epi and investigations and really going to get some data out to us this week and next week. So I'm super excited about that. And when I get that information, I'll be sure and share it with all of you. So I'm hoping to have some new things to share. So these are the things that are in that epidemiological questionnaire. It's a long questionnaire, and there's many questions under each of these categories. These are just the main categories, but I'm really hoping to see some data come out of this week. And I'm super excited, as I said, to share some of this. This came out from USDA last week, so it's about 2 weeks old now, but they're trying to give us kind of that clinical picture of what they're seeing out there. So, they're looking at things like days of clinical signs, like how long are animals actually showing that they're sick, around 7, it looks like. They're dropping in milk for about 8 days. And then there's a number of clinical signs reported. So you'll see on the right-hand side of the screen here, mostly it's decreased milk production, abnormal milk, and they get this kind of thick, sticky milk, and then also decreased feed consumption. So those are some of the things, but we all know that those are pretty, vague clinical signs that could be consistent with lots of different differential diagnoses. So sometimes it might be hard to detect, but I will talk a little bit later about how dairy farmers use technology to find these animals sooner, so we can actually predict which animals might get sick before they're ever really even clinical. So that's really good news. And then, as I mentioned, just kind of what the milk looks like. So nothing too new for us, but thought I would show that and share that data. USDA also shared this slide that shows some of the epidemiological risk factors they've identified for moving this virus. So we do understand that this was a point source introduction of disease. So we know that in Texas somewhere, in some probably mixed backyard species situation, there was the spillover event, a single spillover event. And then that spilled over, or that was laterally transmitted to a dairy farm in Texas and has spread from there. So it seems like once it gets into the cow, even though it seems to be an opportunistic infection, doesn't seem to be a systemic infection so much, but kind of just in that mammary gland, really likes the mammary tissue in the mammary gland, but it really has found a way to spread laterally. So that's the real concern. So one point source introduction, and all of these dairies have been infected from there. So 60 plus dairies. So that's concerning. So we need to better understand how this virus is being transmitted so we can better understand how to stop it. So we know that in some of the data that's come back from Michigan and Texas and some of these other states, Idaho, that's really a lot of it is like we're, shared equipment, same vehicles, rendering trucks. Maybe it's the veterinarian, maybe it's the AI technician, or people that are selling feed or transporting feed. So we're really thinking there's a human element to this, and it may be fomites, but it may be the human themselves. So they're even seeing shared farm workers are spreading this between different types of operations, so between poultry and dairy. So we're certainly really concerned about that, but visitors and moving trucks and trailers are definitely high concern. And I think it really speaks to the fact that we don't want to walk on these dairies. We don't want to just help ourselves and say, hey, you want some PPE? Hey, how can I help you? Hey, can I write you a biosecurity plan? No, because we really need these farms to not have traffic and not have visitors as much as possible, at least not without some controls in place. So I'm going to talk to you at the end about some farm tours that are coming up, which I think is a really good idea, but taking the precautions that we need to take to protect these dairy cows from us, the humans who may be actually spreading this thing around. And that's a real concern. The other thing, as I mentioned earlier, USDA is working on these epidemiological studies. And one of the things they're really looking at is the wildlife, the wild mammal component to this. And interestingly, if you get on the website there for HPAI and wild mammals, they have, USDA has their website. The last few detections you'll see in New Mexico, they're finding it in house mice, a lot of them. So now we have animals that are maybe asymptomatic, aren't necessarily dying, but we're finding this virus in there. So we know that rodent control is a real important piece of biosecurity, but we also know rodents can move things either as fomites or maybe even systemically between farms. We've seen them do that in backyard poultry operations with salmonella. Why couldn't they do it with something like this? So that's some of the work that's being unpacked right now. We're trying to better understand what the role of wildlife is. We've also seen in Michigan and some of the other states where we've seen the red fox come up positive, and then certainly some cats, some possums. So if you get on there, you can see all the different things that have been identified, at least with the HPAI and dairy cattle. Now the map here that's on the right, that's all the detections since the beginning of HPAI 2 years ago. So, 15 or 16 different wild mammalian species. Most of the time, it's a systemic disease, causes neurologic disease and death. But we're continuing to monitor this, especially in things like mice or rodents, where maybe it doesn't cause mortality. Okay, so it's really important that that we're thinking about biosecurity. So when we think about the epidemiological piece of this, the best way that we can prevent lateral spread is to really consider biosecurity. We're really fortunate here in Washington because in the last 2 years, we've kind of worked with this NABPREP grant with both Dairygold and WSU Vet Med Extension over there at Craig McConnell. And we've worked with Tammy Edmonds with Dairygold, and we've gotten some veterinary students together to put these secure milk supply plans together. And what they are enhanced biosecurity plans. And we have about 120 of these plans already done in Washington State, which is great. It kind of gives us that leg up. And we have 2 new students identified to start this project. In fact, they started this week. So it's really exciting. So hopefully we'll get another, 40 or 50 plans written to really cover our industry. But one of the barriers that came up last year that 2 of our students identified was that one of the things that our farms don't have are on-site truck washes. And we know that there's a lot of trucks and traffic moving on and off farms. So that is something that we've seen as a deficit. And then in 2014, the dairy NOM study was done. So every year they pick a different industry and they do these gigantic studies. And so I pulled up that report, and they talk about biosecurity in there. And it was really interesting because what they were showing is that almost all farms, no matter what size operation is, allow visitors in the animal areas. So you'll see in that top left graphic there, 100% of small, medium, and almost 100% of large operations allow visitors in animal areas. And that's a huge problem for HPAI and dairy cow right now. And then also thinking about what's the biosecurity practice to prevent that? Well, wearing booties or footwear that's disinfectable or using foot baths. And very few farms are using any of those kinds of biosecurity mechanisms. So I think the most important thing we can do right now is to stay off of those farms, at least stay out of animal areas, because that is a high risk factor for affected farms. I think when we're in an unaffected state, we can do a little bit different biosecurity than when we actually know we have infection, but it's something we all need to consider. So just last week, USDA's rolled out the federal order. They've rolled out some incentives for being able to provide some financial assistance. And then last week, they rolled out a voluntary program where they're really looking to establish herd status between dairies. So what they're asking dairies to do is enroll in a bulk tank testing plan that would allow them, once deemed kind of like free or kind of this monitored unaffected herd status, that they could move animals across state lines without having to do individual animal testing. It's kind of hard here in Washington because it's not a great incentive for our producers because we don't actually move very many dairy cattle across state lines because, once a dairy cow has a baby and she starts milking, she doesn't really want to leave. She needs a milking parlor. And so the way our industry works here is usually once cows calve and they're in lactation, they stay on the farm until they're ready to, go to a processing plant and become hamburger, but for the most part, once they calve, they're here. So we're trying to work on a voluntary program here in Washington, something that would make sense for our own producers. We did meet with some of our key stakeholders about 2 weeks ago to talk about what that could look like for raw milk dairies and how we could incentivize that. And we're also working with our processors to see what that could look like in Washington State for all of our producers of what would work best for them and what's going to be practical and feasible based on the infrastructure that we already have in place for sample collection. So more to come on that. Don't have a lot of updates yet, but we are actually working really hard on that to see what that should look like. I wanted to bring this up too. So we do have an HPAI and cattle resource on our website with WSDA. And so if you Google our WSDA, HPAI and cattle, this should come up for you. And I wanted to point out that Aaron Coyle, like I mentioned from the from our emergency management program at WSDA, puts together these great briefs. So if you're looking for a brief or you're looking to provide some information, really nice distilled down information, easy to digest, that will be great for you to distribute to, anybody that is interested in this topic. So don't be afraid to use that website. I wanted to remind everybody about what does the dairy industry look like here in Washington State. We have about 419 dairies here, mostly concentrated in Whatcom, Benton, Franklin, Klickitat, and Yakima County, but we do have dairies probably in almost every county, just maybe not very many, but they're mostly distributed in those counties. And we've had no cases reported in Washington State. We are continuing to monitor this. We've got great relationships with our livestock veterinarians and Vet Med Extension, and we feel really confident that at this point in time, we still don't have it here. We do have some plans for what we're going to do once we do get a confirmed case here. Right now, any animals that are moved into our state, we have Dr. Bruce Hutton tracing those animals to make sure that we know what's going on, make sure we're reaching out. But like I said, we don't really bring lactating animals into our state, so the risk is relatively low. The highest risk for us is just truck traffic, people traffic, visitors from affected farms. But as far as moving lactating animals, not something that we really do. And we're going to continue to respond to this very much in the same way that we've been responding to HPAI and poultry for the last 2 years. A little bit different because obviously we're not going to be depopulating because this is not a highly pathogenic disease of dairy cattle. They recover. Whereas in poultry, it's certainly an animal welfare concern because they're suffering a lot, whereas cattle don't. So a little bit different in the way we respond in that regard, but for the most part, the same. We're in unified command with USDA. We have great partners. We're setting up a quarantine area or quarantine on those farms so those animals can't move. And we're permitting the movement of those animals. So once we're on an affected farm, nothing moves without us knowing about it or we're permitting it. And mostly lactating animals will just be permitted to move to slaughter, but that's it. And then to get out of that quarantine, those farms will have to test their bulk tanks. And we're going to recommend weekly just so we can track that, because we know what we're seeing in other states is that those cows fully recover in about 5 to 6 weeks after the farm starts to show clinical illness. So we're looking at that. We're also looking at ways we can do bulk tank testing to maybe detect this virus sooner before we even have clinical animals. But again, that's part of the strategy that we're working on with our processors and producers and the Bovine Issues Working Group to see what that should look like in Washington State. And again, hopefully we'll have that kind of worked out here in the next few weeks to see what we can do, if anything. Okay. So I wanted to just mention real quick animal disease traceability and the importance of this. We have a really robust system here in Washington State. We use the RFID tag. It's an electronic tag, but it can also be readable just from the naked eye. And we use these readers. So you'll see down in the lower left corner, this is Dr. Jake Murphy at Everson Auction Market. And we scan these animals and we can track them. So we have these kind of readings on points in time. So we'd like to know, like, where were they born? They get scanned there. We get those certificates through a brucellosis vaccination. And, every time they move, we have places where we're scanning those animals and we're recording those tags, and we can track movement. We can also track those movements through health certificates. So any animal that moves between states. And they're all kind of put into this repository in this thing called animal tracks that we have at the state. So we actually know where animals are. We have a very robust system to be able to track animals through time. And this is really important for us to be able to trace animals and for early detection. I also wanted to point out that the RFID tag isn't just for us. It isn't just for animal disease traceability, but dairy farms use these tags for lots of things. So they're very sophisticated. They have apps on their telephones. The ear tag is read by a computer system that monitors things like heat detection, so activity, how much have they walked today? Are they walking more than normal or less than normal? So they're comparing trends. They can detect rumination. Rumination is one of those things you saw on those early detectors or clinical signs of HPAI in dairy cattle. So a lot of these health measures that come from this tag can help us find those animals before they ever become clinically ill. And that's really, really important. These monitoring systems allow the producer to download a report, and they can actually, separate animals out based on certain criteria and find those animals sooner. So I just want to make sure people knew that dairy farms are very progressive. They have really embraced technology. They use technology to the fullest, and it's really awesome. So even, the bigger the farm, sometimes the more technology they're able to institute into the farm, and that helps them become more efficient, but it also helps with animal welfare because they can find those animals quicker and help them if they're not feeling well. But it also could be an early predictor of disease for HPAI and dairy cattle, and it has been used in that way. So I just wanted folks to know that our producers are very proactive in that space. All right, so Dr. Snekvik couldn't be on this morning, but he did provide me with a few slides. I just wanted folks to know that we have a super sophisticated laboratory. It's beautiful. I hope at some point you all will get an opportunity to go out there and do a tour because it's just a super phenomenal facility. We have a lot of capacity there, some very highly trained individuals. And Dr. Snekvik has just been a rock star with us working on HPAI for the last 2 years. They do all of our regulatory work here, and they are a non-lab, which means that they can do a lot of the testing for emerging diseases as well as foreign animal diseases. And they have to do proficiency testing to be able to meet that status. So they're just a phenomenal laboratory. We're lucky to work with them. So Dr. Snekvik is working on getting all of the samples that they've been doing to date and getting them posted on the website so folks understand that we are looking for this disease. We're doing a lot of surveillance. And he does a lot of work for not just Washington, but also for Idaho and Nevada and sometimes other states because he is a non-lab. They are a non-lab. And so right now they've done about 332 samples, but you have to understand that each sample could be reflective of multiple animals of a pooled sample. So you'll see there's milk samples here, there's bulk tank samples here. So we've got a lot of work being done at our non-lab, and I do feel very confident that if it shows up here, we're going to know about it really, really quickly. So again, you can reach out to Dr. Snekvik if you have any specific questions about the laboratory or sampling. If you get on their website, they have awesome information about how to sample cows, how to submit samples, all of the things. So get on the WSU WADA website and you'll get all the information that you need. I also wanted to mention that if you do want to know more about the dairy industry and you're interested in it and you just know nothing about dairy farms or how they work, there is going to be a farm tour up in Whatcom County this weekend, this Saturday. There's, I think, 8 different farms there. Some of them are some of them are producer handlers, so they process, they might have products. Some of them have robotics to showcase, so, robotic milking systems. Just phenomenal opportunity here. And we have worked with the Bovine Issues Working Group and the Dairy Products Commission to make sure that we're keeping people and animals safe on these tours, so there will be no direct contact with animals in these facilities. We will not be walking into farms. We'll be staying on the outside. But certainly it's an awesome opportunity to learn about dairy farms. And I would encourage anybody who would like to know more to go ahead and participate this weekend. So that's going to be up here in Whatcom County on Saturday. And I will be there. So hopefully I'll get to see some of you. Okay, just again on the mental health resources, they're out there and available. And you can work with Department of Health on this as well. So we're continuing to make sure that our producers and our responders feel supported in this space. So that's it for today. If you have any questions, concerns, you can always email me or call me. We'll be continuing to do these weekly updates. I'm hoping to have some really exciting stuff for you here coming up in the next week or two as we see more of the epi data get put together, and hopefully we will be able to prevent HPAI in livestock in Washington State, and also be nice to have the summer off in our poultry. So be safe, and thank you for everybody and their collaboration out there and their hard work. And I'm just feel really honored and privileged to work with so many great partners, both in our industry and with Department of Health, and even our emergency management coordinator, who's just done an awesome job. So I want to thank everybody, and we'll see you next week.